What can an almost 200-year-old novel tell us about the fate of Stannis Baratheon in The Winds of Winter? When you think of Stannis Baratheon, do you imagine Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised? Or do you see a peg-legged sea captain bent on revenge? When you imagine his sword, Lightbringer, do you think of a harpoon? I'd like to do a little bit of comparative literary analysis of A Song of Ice and Fire and Moby Dick, a connection I haven't seen the fandom cover in any real capacity. So why read Stannis as Ahab, and why isn't anyone talking about this? George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire is usually examined as a work of fantasy rather than a work of American literature. When Martin's work gets compared to that of other authors, names like Tolkien, Rothfuss, Ted Williams, and Brandon Sanderson are brought up, but not Melville. Fantasy fans tend to stick to their dragons, while scholars of 19th century American literature tend to stick to their more serious scholarship, and usually the camps remain separated. But Martin is incredibly well-read, and he's well-read in a way that few other authors are. He knows his Shakespeare, he knows his Stan Lee. He's read his Bible and his Bradbury. He's hidden references in his books that pull from Lovecraft and Norse myth, but also from The Three Stooges, The Muppets, and the Fantastic Four. On his blog, Martin has mentioned Captain Ahab 3 times over the years, each time using him as a favorite example of a timeless literary character, the kinds of characters that he strives to imitate in his own work. For those who haven't read Moby Dick, you really should. It might have a reputation as an inaccessible old tome, but that's hardly the case. If you can handle A Song of Ice and Fire, if you can make it through all 37 Tyrion chapters in A Dance with Dragons, Moby Dick should be a cinch. But in the meantime, I'll do my best to summarize the relevant components as we go along. So, spoiler warning for a 200-year-old book. Once you see this Moby Dick connection, you can't unsee it. And once you realize that Martin is deliberately pulling from Ahab and using him as an archetype to develop his own characterization of Stannis, you can start asking the important question: how will Stannis die? Because as hard as it might be for some Stannis fans to swallow, I think Stannis, like Ahab, is a doomed character. I think that Martin and Melville are using these characters to show how a certain type of leadership, while beguiling, is ultimately destructive. We hear whispers of Stannis in A Game of Thrones, but it isn't until A Clash of Kings that we see him up close. Ned Stark acts as the ostensible protagonist of the first book, so once he's dead, Martin introduces Stannis as a sort of proxy Ned, serving the same political cause. When we are finally introduced to Robert's cold and brooding brother on Dragonstone, we see that Stannis, like Ahab, is part of a crew. The prologue of A Clash of Kings has to do a lot for the reader. It has to introduce a whole cast of characters, each with different but intersecting motives and personalities. To a reader familiar with Moby Dick, it becomes clear that Martin uses the crew of the Pequod as a ready-made template for the crew on Dragonstone. Stannis is defined by his relationships to these other characters: Davos, his reformed smuggler of a right-hand man; Melisandre, his mysterious red priestess; and even Patchface, the once-drowned fool who speaks in riddles. And we might as well mention a couple of non-human actors here: Lightbringer, his apparently magic sword, and the Iron Throne, the object of the disgruntled king's obsession. All of these have their analogues in Moby Dick. So before we get into what this means for the Winds of Winter, let's meet the crew of the Pequod. Ahab, the monomaniacal captain of the Pequod, is one of literature's larger-than-life figures. He's more than just a crazy person hell-bent on killing the white whale, although that is a big part of it. He's a fated character, deeply embedded in questions of doom and destiny. For our purposes, it's important to note that Ahab is a cold and distant man, and that he is repeatedly described in the novel as a king. He is the king of his ship, and his mates and harpooners are his knights and squires. So a feudal adaptation of Moby Dick is far from a stretch. It's already baked into Melville's novel. Ahab's first mate, his most loyal knight, is Starbuck. Starbuck is a scrupulous and God-fearing man, torn between the devotion he feels toward his captain and his strong moral compass. For Starbuck, Ahab's pursuit of the white whale sometimes seems crazy and blasphemous, but he always remains loyal. While at sea, his thoughts often turn to his wife and son. In one famous moment that comes near the end of the novel, Starbuck, while walking into Ahab's cabin, is tempted by a loaded musket. At this point, Ahab's mania has been proven. He has dragged his men along while he pursues a doomed and dangerous mission, and a thundering tempest storms around them. Starbuck sees the musket as a chance to put an end to this madness by killing Ahab. He ponders this decision for a while before ultimately choosing against regicide and mutiny, and Ahab goes on to lead his entire crew to destruction. Ahab's other advisor is far more mysterious. Fedallah, an exoticized Parsi from some far-off land, is Ahab's personal prophet. As a Zoroastrian, fire is central to his religion. The men of the Pequod are suspicious of him and think he's a demon, but Ahab keeps him close, believing that Fedallah's powers will be beneficial in the quest to kill the white whale. Fedallah delivers a prophecy, saying that Ahab can only be killed by a hempen rope. Ahab takes this as a good sign, believing that he will be hanged on land from a gallows. But of course, Ahab is eventually strangled in a harpoon line and pulled beneath the sea by Moby Dick. I think the parallels to Stannis and company are obvious at this point. If Stannis is Ahab, then Davos is Starbuck, and Melisandre is Fedallah. And we haven't even talked about Pip yet. Pip starts out as a light-hearted cabin boy, but he falls overboard and is lost at sea, assumed to drown. When Pip is eventually recovered, his joviality is gone. Now he is morose, speaking in riddles and prophecies. The book tells us that Pip, while drowning, encountered a merman realm of inverse reality. Because of this, his shipmates call him mad, but he might be the only one speaking any sense. Patchface is Pip. Ahab does not wield an ordinary harpoon. He asks the ship's blacksmith to forge a new weapon, one that he tempers not in water, but in the blood of his 3 harpooners. This thrice blood-tempered weapon is therefore apparently imbued with magical properties. Or maybe not, because Ahab is not ultimately successful. At one point in the novel, Ahab catches St. Elmo's fire on his harpoon and brandishes the flaming weapon in front of his crew to remind them of their loyalty oaths. Fedallah worships this mysterious flame, but others take it as a sign that Ahab has aligned himself with the devil. Lightbringer is this harpoon. And finally, in a pretty straightforward way, the Iron Throne, as the object of Stannis' obsession, is the white whale. The way I see it, there are 2 options here. First, the template. Martin has lifted these characters and plot points from Moby Dick because he knows they work, because they make for a great story, and because he wants to replicate that. If Martin continues to use Moby Dick as a template, we can predict Stannis' fate pretty succinctly. Stannis will continue in his Ahab-like obsession to claim the Iron Throne, even in the face of defeat, whether that's at the hands of the Boltons, young Griff, or Daenerys. His refusal to back down from his monomaniacal quest will be his doom. Melisandre's prophecies, like Fedallah's, will go either unheeded or misinterpreted. Patchface's foreboding riddles will continue to be ignored. Davos, like Starbuck, will be presented with an opportunity to kill his king and put an end to the madness, but he will ultimately cave to his loyalty and spare Stannis' life, a decision that will lead to more bloodshed and the collapse of Stannis' entire crew. Such a straightforward adaptation of the Moby Dick story works, especially given that Martin has insisted that Stannis will indeed burn Shireen, a decision that will likely have a significant impact on the story at large. And when I say impact, I don't mean that the sacrifice of her magical king's blood will magically magic a miraculous victory. As far as Martin's literary project is concerned, mechanical questions like that are trivial compared to the battles being waged inside the hearts of his characters. If Martin decides to deviate from the Moby Dick template in order to say something new, his characters can make different decisions that will lead to different outcomes. This is why I think that the question of Davos's loyalty will be the deciding factor here. If we read Davos's Starbuck, we can expect him to have a musket moment, where he questions the authority and sanity of the man he has served for so long and is given the opportunity to kill his captain, his king, in order to save the lives of others. This musket question of killing the one to save the many has been a defining feature of the Stannis plotline from the beginning. Cressen's attempt to kill Melisandre, Davos's rescue of Edric Storm, and the confirmation of Shireen's upcoming death all foreshadow another life-or-death resolution to this story's climax. The first few Davos chapters in A Dance with Dragons are, in my opinion, an excellent portrait of his current mental turmoil. By separating him from Stannis, Martin is able to show us who he is and what he thinks about when his king isn't around. If these chapters feel boring to some readers, it's because they, like many of the plotlines in A Dance with Dragons, are the beginning of a narrative arc that sadly remains unfinished by the end of the book. These chapters are full of fodder for our Davos as Starbuck reading. Davos repeatedly reflects on his loyalty to Stannis. He questions the lengths he has gone to in the past and wonders whether he should have gone with Salladhor Saan and abandoned his king in favor of a simple life with his wife and remaining sons. His thoughts turn to Edric Storm, a moment where Davos put his own morals above the expectation of his duty. We should also note that Davos saving Edric parallels a future musket moment of mutiny or regicide. When Davos saves Edric, he disobeys his king, valuing the immediate life of a single boy over the hypothetical lives saved by a Stannis victory. It's important to note that sacrificing Edric was intended to produce a regicide. "Your Grace," said Davos, "the cost." "I know the cost. Last night, gazing into that hearth, I saw things in the flames as well. I saw a king, a crown of fire on his brows, burning. Burning, Davos. His own crown consumed his flesh and turned him into ash. Do you think I need Melisandre to tell me what that means? Or you? If Joffrey should die, what is the life of one bastard boy against a kingdom?" "Everything," said Davos softly. Of course, both Edric and Joffrey are bastard boys, and both Joffrey and Stannis are kings. So this exchange can be read a few ways. Stannis is intent on killing an innocent in order to bring about the death of a king, but the ambiguity also imagines an alternative, the killing of a king in order to save the innocent people of the kingdom. Killing Ahab to save the men of the Pequod. Davos's chapters in A Dance with Dragons linger on his past so much because he's conflicted. His heart is torn between what he thinks is right and what he must do out of loyalty. These chapters are also full of meditations on Davos's place within the feudal order. Is he a knight, a lord, a hand of the king? Or is he one of the small folk, a smuggler, and a criminal? And for some purely vibes-based evidence of our Moby Dick connection, it's interesting to note how much whale imagery Martin has scattered throughout these Davos chapters. The inn he stays at is called the Belly of the Whale. Marble mermaids in Lord Manderley's castle hold bowls of burning whale oil, and a leviathan is painted on the wall behind Wyman's throne. We also get some obvious references to classics of Western literature, the Bible, Lord Byron, and Hamlet. This isn't just world building. This isn't just a setup for Wyman Manderley's famous "My son is home" speech. This is Martin actively engaging in a literary tradition in order to link his novel to an established theme. This is why literary analysis is valuable here. Perhaps the most important thing to remember in our comparison of Martin and Melville is that Moby Dick is not just a book about Captain Ahab and his obsessive hunt for the white whale. In fact, there are large stretches of Moby Dick where Ahab doesn't even appear. Melville is more interested in the relationships between the crew and their collective loyalty to their captain, a relationship he links to the medieval feudal system. Because Moby Dick is, among many other things, about why people remain loyal to a leader even when it becomes clear that that leader is undeserving of their loyalty. In this sense, it's a novel about revolution. By repeatedly describing him as a king or an emperor, Melville invites us to read Ahab as Julius Caesar, Charles I, or George III. Captain Ahab is a tyrant, but his men follow him anyway, and they follow him to their doom. In many ways, Davos has been the moral compass of A Song of Ice and Fire. As fans, we like to tag along with him and share in his loyalty to Stannis. Here I think it could be valuable to talk about one last character from Moby Dick, one I haven't mentioned yet. Ishmael, as anyone knows who's read at least the famous first sentence, is the narrator of Moby Dick. He serves as a stand-in for the reader, and in one interesting moment of clarity, he admits to being completely enchanted by Ahab and fully involved in this doomed mission. I, Ishmael, was one of that crew. My shouts had gone up with the rest, my oath had been welded with theirs, and stronger I shouted, and more did I hammer and clinch my oath because of the dread in my soul. A wild, mysterious, sympathetical feeling was in me. Ahab's quenchless feud seemed mine. When I first picked up A Clash of Kings, I was Ishmael. With Ned Stark dead, I needed someone to root for, and Stannis, from the perspective of the lovable Davos, filled that void. As the story went on, I continued to side with Stannis, despite his repeated willingness to harm and kill people to get what he wants. I loved Stannis because Davos loved Stannis. On rereads, I think it's a lot more complicated. When we last saw him, Davos was starting to doubt his loyalty, and when he gets back from Skagos, he might return to find Stannis looking a lot like a crazed Captain Ahab. If he sees that Stannis is willing to burn his own daughter in exchange for a military victory, Davos will have to wrestle with some tough decisions. When he chose to save Edric Storm, Davos acted against Stannis' utilitarian calculus in favor of his own gut-feeling morality, saving the bastard boy instead of the hypothetical kingdom. Davos has been through a lot since then, and whatever happens in the Winds of Winter, Stannis and Davos will have a couple more bastard boys to reckon with. Jon Snow, Ramsay Bolton, and even young Griff, Aegon Blackfyre. When Davos, like Starbuck, is presented with an opportunity to save innocent lives and put an end to a doomed and violent mission, will he remain loyal to his king or to his morals? Will Davos be the one to kill Stannis? I think he might be. We've got a lot of waiting to do until The Winds of Winter comes out. Instead of drowning in pessimism, I recommend picking up a different book, and preferably an old one. The best parts of A Song of Ice and Fire are the moments that have nothing to do with the magic or mechanics of the setting. As Martin puts it, all of that is just furniture. The most poignant moments in the series are the internal struggles of his characters, and these moments are the ones that are the most essential to Martin's larger thematic project. There's a lot more I wanted to get to in this video that we'll have to wait for another time. Symbolic apples, Rasputin, and an 18th century poem that explains the secrets of the Children of the Forest. If you're interested, subscribe.